All right, this is lecture number 2 for imperialism. Today we're going to focus on the Spanish-American War. So we're going to kind of go back a little bit and talk about the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine was obviously created under President Monroe, and it basically created a sphere of influence in the Western Hemisphere for the United States, saying that if any people try to come around the Western Hemisphere, mostly the Caribbean, we're going to try to keep them out. So they're not allowing people to take over our what we perceive to be our lands. Teddy Roosevelt creates the Roosevelt Corollary to this, basically saying that all their nations need to leave us alone, and we're going to be basically a police force. Okay, we create this great white fleet. You can see in the picture in the background these white ships that were really, really intimidating, and Teddy Roosevelt used these ships to show the power of the United States, which we talked about in class. That a strong navy is really important to maintaining an empire. What he does is he actually wants to take these ships on a parade around the world to show how powerful we've become. And Teddy Roosevelt's always good with words, and he kind of has a comment to say about the fact that our government didn't want to spend the money to send the ships around the world. So this is what he says. He says, very well then, the existing appropriation will carry the Navy halfway around the world, and if Congress chooses to leave it on the other side, all right. So basically what he's saying is I have enough money and it's fueled to get them all over the world, and if Congress doesn't want to give him the money to get them back, then he'll leave all the ships where they're at. So kind of a little bit of Teddy's pizzazz there. Okay, so there's some problems in the Caribbean. Spain has most of control of the Caribbean, and the Cubans are unhappy with the Spanish rule, so they start to revolt. They're led by a guy named Jose Marti, and he leads the Cubans in trying to revolt against Spain. So Spain starts to push Cubans into concentration camps, and there's 300,000 in camps, and thousands of them are dying. And this is a really big deal. Not that we would normally care about it, but our journalists are going and they're seeing what's going on and they're publishing it. And something called yellow journalism starts to arise. And yellow journalism is like striking news, like when you hear extra extra and read all about it, and you see images that are really powerful, and they're just basically trying to push images and articles that are going to sell newspapers. And they don't necessarily have to be true. Sometimes they made up the news, but they would just kind of do whatever they could to make as much money as possible. So there's two really famous publishers, Joseph Pulitzer, the Pulitzer Prize, and then William Randolph Hearst. Maybe you've heard of Hearst Castle. I'll show you some pictures in a minute, but they're really, really famous as being really successful. One of the reasons or the ways that these images were spread was through the penny press. Okay, and this appealed to the poor because the papers only had pennies, so they could get a paper and get entertainment and reading for very cheap. And this also allowed these newspaper moguls to sell a lot of product. Okay, so here's these two guys, Joseph Pulitzer. Okay, he was born in 1847 in Hungary. He made his fortune running the New York World. That was the newspaper that he ran. He became a congressman for the state of New York, and he donated a lot of money to Columbia University, and then that's when they created the Pulitzer Prize for Excellence in Writing. William Randolph Hearst was born in 1863. His parents were millionaire miners. He started the newspaper, the New York Journal, and became a congressman as a Democrat. And his journalism quality was suspect, and it was normally critiqued as yellow journalism. So he made his money in a shady way sometimes. All right, here's his house. Okay, it's called Hearst Castle. Some of you may have been there. Obviously, it's enormous. Here's some pictures of the inside. Here's a pool over here on the left, and his dining room, and an indoor pool over here. So just an amazing building where he spent all his money. So he was extremely wealthy. Okay, so we have these problems in the Caribbean, and we kind of are starting to critique what's going on, and we start to see that war is possibly in sight. So there's a letter called the Delome letter. It's Deputy Delome, and he's from the Spanish minister, and he's living in Washington, and he basically writes a letter calling McKinley weak and a bitter for the admiration of the crowd, meaning that he doesn't do anything but to get good ratings from the crowd. And this is actually a really common U.S. feeling. We know that McKinley was promoted by the rich, defeating William Jennings Bryan a couple of times, and people weren't that fond of him, especially the lower class. But the problem is, even though they didn't like him very much, we didn't like that other countries were calling our president, bad. It'd be like, if your family, your brother or sister, you pick on them all the time, but as soon as someone else wants to pick on your brother or sister, you're going to get after them and say, you can't say that about my family. It's the same sort of idea here. So we get a little bit upset with Spain there. And then we have a spark to war. You'll see sparks to war all the time. It's like an excuse to go to war. One of our battleships in Havana Harbor, it randomly blows up. And 260 American soldiers die, the sailors, and we assume that the Spanish exploded the ship, that there is some secret weapon that was used to blow up our ship. And this is yellow journalism at its finest. They print huge pictures and articles about it. And when we look back at it in history, we've done some investigations, and we understand that it's probably an accidental explosion in the weapons bay. So here's an image that comes out. You can see how not ridiculous, but it's very expressive. You can see the bodies flying out in the ocean, and it's very intentional to make you think that there's some really bad things happening, that this was a really, really awful event, which it was. But when you see this, you really start to get angry towards Spain. And here's a newspaper from the New York Journal saying Spanish treachery. So they're already saying that it was Spain and there was no investigation going on. So this sparks war, and war starts. And even though this happened in Cuba, the war actually begins in the Philippines in Manila Bay. A man named George Dewey leads our U.S. forces, and he gets a man named Emilio Aguinaldo. He's a Philippine rebel who had already started to fight against Spain. He was in Hong Kong. He goes and gets him, and he assists. And Aguinaldo assists us in fighting against the Spanish rule. We win very quickly, and we free the free the Filipinos from Spanish rule. And then the war goes on in Cuba. This is where you see Teddy Roosevelt rising back up, or rising to his prominence. He leaves his governorship in New York, and he goes and fights in the Battle of San Juan Hill. He has a group called the Rough Riders. This is them. These guys are like the special forces of the day. They're the ones that could be like a small group that would just dominate people. And the San Juan Hill is a key victory for the United States, and Teddy Roosevelt becomes a hero, and this is really going to boost his image when he comes back to be involved in politics in the 1900s. So the end of the war, it was a short war. We had someone call it a splendid little war, one of our diplomats, and it was just like kind of real quick and got to business. Spain wasn't really ready to fight. Their fleet was not armed and ready, and we were ready to go, and Teddy Roosevelt had us raring to fight. So it was only 16 weeks. It was ended by the Treaty of Paris in 1898. We got some key components to the treaty of some of the things that we get. Cuba gains their independence and becomes a U.S. protectorate, so we're kind of in charge of making sure that they're safe. And we'll talk about that in a minute, or in a future lecture. Spain cedes Puerto Rico and the Pacific island of Guam to the United States, so they are our territories and still are our territories today. And the United States gives $20 million for the annexation of the Philippine Islands as a territory. So the Philippines becomes a territory of ours as well, and we ended up paying for it. And the key thing about the Spanish-American War, even though a lot of people don't really remember it and forget about it, is it really shows that we're now a worldwide naval power. Spain was supposed to be like the second strongest navy in the world, and now we've proved that we are either first or second, right along with England. So if not, besides like the colonies that we're gathering and the resources that we're now going to have, we also have that naval superiority that we've talked about, and how important it is to be a strong country, as far as a strong navy to make our country seem powerful. So that's it for the Spanish-American War.